Listen carefully, because after this, you'll never see mothers, daughters, or family loyalty the same way again. Imagine a candlelit room in a Newport mansion, where every shadow seems to lean forward, listening, and every polished surface reflects a truth too ugly to speak aloud. The sound of the ocean outside, rhythmic, hypnotic, like a ritual drum. This is where it began. A betrayal so intimate it ruptured not only a family, but an entire illusion of class, virtue, and respectability. Most people will tell you that society's most dangerous predators lurk in alleys or backrooms. They're wrong. The real predators host dinner parties, whisper blessings over engagements, and smile with perfect porcelain teeth while they calculate your weakness. The woman you're about to meet mastered that art so completely she made the devil look amateur. Margaret Aldridge. Remember that name, 47 years old in the spring of 1861, wearing her mourning black like a crown of power. A widow of means, a matriarch of ice. She understood the tides of inheritance, marriage, and reputation better than any politician or banker of her time. She had 2 daughters, Eleanor and Catherine, and in their soft youth, she saw nothing but assets to be managed, alliances to be forged, pawns on her personal chessboard. This wasn't motherhood as you've been told. This was strategic ownership, bloodlines as capital. Her eldest, Eleanor, was about to marry the perfect man, Charles Whitfield. Handsome, connected, wealthy, Nelvie. He was supposed to be the solution to the Aldridge family's financial erosion. The vessel through which old money would merge with new. That was the plan on paper. But Margaret saw something in Charles she hadn't tasted in years: leverage, vulnerability, hunger. It thrilled her like a scent in the wild. And so the trap opened, not with a scandal, not with a knife, but with a glass of brandy on a terrace under a full moon. This is how power really works. It doesn't demand, it seduces. It makes you believe you're stepping into freedom, when in fact you're stepping into a cage. Charles Whitfield believed he was entering a marriage. He was really entering a ritual. Now lean closer, because what happened inside that Newport mansion was not just a crime of passion. It was an initiation into a darker system of control, one that still echoes today. And if you're ready to see how deep it goes, keep listening. But understand, once you know, you can't unknow. They tell you betrayal feels like a sudden knife. They're wrong. The deepest betrayals unfold slowly, like a ritual poisoning. A little more each night until the victim doesn't even remember what normal feels like. In the weeks leading to Eleanor's wedding, Margaret Aldridge perfected this art. By day she was the impeccable hostess, arranging flowers and guest lists, playing the role of doting mother, preparing her daughter's future. By night she became something else, an architect of hunger and confusion, pulling Charles deeper into her orbit with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a predator. Charles thought he was visiting Ravenscroft Manor to finalize legal papers. But the legal papers were only bait. Margaret understood the male psyche the way a chess master understands openings. She studied him, his doubts, his ambitions, his weaknesses. Every conversation with her became a small test, every glass of brandy a dose of surrender, every accidental touch a tether binding him closer to a future he didn't yet see coming. She wasn't merely seducing him from her daughter, she was teaching him a secret language, the language of complicity. And here's the hidden truth men rarely admit to themselves: complicity is more powerful than lust. It isn't enough to possess someone. You must make them hold your secret. You must make them need you for their own survival. Margaret wasn't simply violating family boundaries. She was inducting Charles into a system of psychological control older than kings and priests. The binding of desire to debt, the binding of guilt to silence. Outside, Newport's elite paraded through drawing rooms, oblivious. Inside, Charles began to change. His letters to Eleanor grew shorter, his gaze toward Margaret longer. He started to echo her phrases, adopt her posture. Second, guess his own fiancé's affections. Eleanor, gentle and obedient, sensed nothing. Catherine, sharper, noticed small fractures but dismissed them as nerves. But you're seeing it with clear eyes now. The betrayal wasn't just sexual, it was spiritual. Margaret was rewriting the script of who Charles believed he was, replacing his loyalties with hers, using shame as a lock and desire as the key. This is how power operates in the dark, not by brute force but by bending the mind until it mistakes captivity for choice. There is a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when seduction crosses the line into programming. That's where Margaret now operated. She no longer needed to lure Charles with smiles and brandy. She was rewriting the code of his identity. It began with late-night conversations on the terrace, but it spread into every room of Ravenscroft Manor. Her voice became a constant whisper in his head, soft yet commanding, telling him who he was, what he feared, what he desired. This is the true weapon of those who rule behind curtains, not violence, but definition. Whoever defines you, owns you. Charles had been trained at Harvard to think in terms of logic and law, but Margaret reached deeper, into shame, craving, and the hidden boyhood need for approval he never outgrew. She wrapped her narratives around him like a serpent. She told him his doubts about Eleanor were normal. She told him only she understood the world as it really worked. How fortunes were built on deception, how alliances always concealed knives. She painted herself as his dark mentor, the only one honest enough to reveal the game. It wasn't just an affair anymore. It was an initiation into forbidden knowledge. And here's the truth they never teach in school. Once a man has tasted forbidden knowledge, he cannot return to innocence. He will either rise or rot. Margaret counted on the rot. She counted on his fear of exposure, on the shame of betraying Eleanor, on the thrill of belonging to a secret. Every night he stayed under her roof. The invisible contracts multiplied. He became her co-author in deceit. His signature appeared on documents he didn't fully read. His legal counsel turned from protecting Eleanor to protecting Margaret. Outside, Newport prepared for the wedding as if nothing were wrong. Inside, a new union was already being forged. Not between bride and groom, but between predator and pupil. Margaret had no intention of merely stealing a man. She was creating an instrument, a living extension of her will. And now I'll ask you directly, as you listen, can you feel it? That faint pull in your own mind? That curiosity mixed with unease? Comment below with the phrase, "Shadows bind twice." Type it twice, to mark the point of no return. This is where the transformation begins. By now Charles wasn't simply drifting toward Margaret. He was being remade by her, like molten metal poured into a hidden mold. What began as flirtation had become ritual. Every glance, every whispered phrase, every glass of amber liquid she pressed into his hand was another stroke of the chisel. Margaret understood the great secret of power. Repetition reshapes belief, and belief reshapes identity. By the end of May 1861, Charles Whitfield no longer thought of himself as a man marrying Eleanor Aldridge. He thought of himself as an initiate standing at the threshold of something vast and forbidden, with Margaret as the high priestess guiding him in. This wasn't just seduction. It was strategic corruption. Margaret began confiding in Charles about matters she should never have spoken aloud. The forged signatures on insurance policies, the timing of her husband's accident, the quiet payments to keep servants silent. Each confession landed like a weight in Charles's chest, but it also bound him closer. If he betrayed her now, he would implicate himself. If he left, she could ruin him. That was the point. Margaret was replacing his fear of society with fear of her. And here's what makes this more than a family scandal. You are watching a blueprint of institutional control in miniature. Nations, corporations, secret societies, they all operate like this. Step 1, isolate. Step 2, reveal forbidden knowledge. Step 3, entangle the initiate in moral compromise. Step 4. Offer belonging as the only escape. Charles thought he was unique. He wasn't. He was being processed. Even his body began to show it. Dark circles under the eyes, restless pacing, a kind of tremor when Margaret entered the room. Eleanor noticed but interpreted it as wedding stress. Catherine noticed too, but in Catherine the observations bred a seed of defiance. She began keeping her own notes, watching her mother and Charles like a natural detective. In the marble halls of Ravenscroft Manor, a mother's love had become a labyrinth, and Charles was lost in it. But Margaret wasn't finished. She was about to test how far she could push him, how deep his hunger for power really went. Because once a man has lost his old loyalties, the next question is inevitable. What is he willing to destroy to prove his devotion to the new order? By early June the wedding was only days away, yet inside Ravenscroft Manor the ceremony had already become a grotesque performance. The flowers, the polished silver, the cathedral booking, all of it was camouflaged for a power transfer. So intimate it could never be spoken aloud. Margaret had maneuvered Charles into a position where he no longer measured right and wrong in moral terms, but in terms of survival. She called it preparing him for the real world. In truth, she was erasing his previous world altogether. One night she led him into her late husband's study, a room sealed off since Edmund's death. The air smelled of dust and old leather, the shelves lined with legal tomes and maritime ledgers. In the center of the desk sat a small iron box. Margaret opened it slowly, revealing documents, letters, and a single vial of pale liquid. "This," she whispered, "is how families endure." She spoke of poisons, of wills rewritten at the last moment, of servants conveniently dismissed before an accident. She told him what would happen if Catherine or even Eleanor ever stood in the way of the family's survival. Charles stood frozen, caught between horror and fascination, while Margaret watched his eyes to see whether fear or desire would dominate. And here's where you, watching this now, need to understand the mechanism. When power tests you, it never begins with a direct order. It begins with a confession. It gives you a glimpse of darkness and watches to see if you flinch. If you don't, the next step is inevitable: complicity. Margaret knew Charles wouldn't run to the police or to Eleanor. She had already seduced not just his body but his self-image. He wanted to believe he was too strong, too clever to be manipulated. That's exactly why it worked. Catherine, meanwhile, began noticing locked doors, whispered conversations, and the way her mother's expression hardened whenever she entered a room. She sensed a storm building, though she couldn't yet name it. Eleanor floated through the days of fitting sessions and menu tastings, unaware that her fiancé was being primed as an accomplice to her own destruction. Margaret, still flawless in public, now held a private power over Charles so complete that the upcoming wedding felt less like a union and more like the staging ground for a sacrifice. And this was the moment, the precipice, where Margaret would demand something of Charles that would seal him to her forever. The night Margaret chose to escalate was heavy with heat and the scent of rain coming off the Atlantic. Lightning flickered beyond the cliffs like a silent warning. She summoned Charles to the West Wing under the pretense of reviewing marriage contracts. But when he arrived, the papers were gone. In their place, on the mahogany desk, lay a single sheet of cream paper with one sentence written in Margaret's exacting hand: "Power demands proof." She closed the door and moved toward him, not as a lover now, but as something closer to a commander. Her voice lost its softness. "If you want the future I've shown you, you must stop pretending you're still the man Eleanor thinks you are. That life is already gone. Tonight you prove it." She revealed a sealed envelope, instructing him to deliver it discreetly to a certain banker in Newport at dawn. Inside, Charles would later discover, was a forged letter implicating a servant in theft. A servant who had seen too much and would soon be dismissed without reference, stripped of livelihood. It was a small task compared to what she could have asked, but that was the point. The first act of loyalty is always small. Charles hesitated, then took the envelope. In that moment, a line crossed in his mind so quietly, he almost didn't feel it. When a man accepts his first assignment in the shadows, he is no longer free. Margaret saw it instantly. The slight slump of his shoulders, the way his eyes dropped. He was hers. And as you hear this, ask yourself, how many times have you been offered an envelope in your own life? A compromise dressed as opportunity, a small betrayal framed as necessity. This is how systems of control replicate. They don't threaten, they test. They don't coerce, they invite. By the time you realize you're caught, you've already acted. Catherine, sensing the change, began quietly questioning the staff, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations. Eleanor, still lost in wedding dreams, didn't see the growing shadows. But Margaret did. She saw the next generation's weak link, and she was already thinking of ways to neutralize it. The storm outside broke, thunder rolling over the manor as Charles slipped the envelope into his coat pocket. In that sound, he heard something he couldn't name. Not thunder, but the closing of a door behind him. By dawn, Charles had delivered the envelope. The banker received it with the bland politeness of a man who has handled far darker requests for Newport's elite. On the walk back through the damp streets, Charles felt something shift inside him. Not guilt exactly, more like a numbness, a hollowing out where his old self had been. Margaret had told him, power demands proof, but what she had really demanded was his surrender. He had given it. And once you surrender, even once, the next act becomes easier. This is how predators train their prey to become accomplices. Back at Ravenscroft Manor, Margaret waited in her private parlor. She greeted him with neither warmth nor disdain, only a single nod. "You've crossed the river," she said quietly. "There's no going back." Then, as if rewarding a student, she poured 2 glasses of dark wine. They drank in silence. Charles felt a strange exhilaration. It was the first time he'd been treated not as Eleanor's fiancé, but as Margaret's equal. Or so he told himself. In truth, she had just tethered him with another invisible chain. Margaret now began to weave larger plans, moving money between accounts, altering the timing of legal documents, and hinting at opportunities that would only work if Eleanor's marriage to Charles was delayed or restructured. Charles, still dazed, provided legal advice that undermined his own engagement. Each signature, each whispered consultation, became another brick in the invisible prison. And here's what you need to see: this was no longer about sex or scandal. It was about transformation. Margaret was turning Charles into a reflection of herself, teaching him to view people as assets, relationships as leverage, morality as a story for the Narv. He was learning the dark grammar of power, and the more he learned, the less he could remember who he'd been before. Catherine, meanwhile, had begun a dangerous game of her own. She slipped into the study when Margaret was away, copying fragments of documents, hiding them under a loose floorboard in her room. She didn't yet know the scale of her mother's manipulation, but she sensed enough to understand that Charles was no longer merely a betrayer. He was becoming something worse, a partner. In the rising summer heat of 1861, Newport society prepared for a wedding. Inside Ravenscroft Manor, another ceremony was already underway, a covert coronation of Margaret Aldridge as the architect of everyone's fate. By mid-June, the wedding invitations were already printed, yet the real drama unfolded behind locked doors. Margaret had shifted into her most dangerous phase, the phase where secrecy becomes strategy. She knew appearances couldn't slip. The cathedral had to be booked, the musicians paid, the carriages polished. But beneath that glittering surface, she and Charles were rehearsing a far darker union. Every evening after dinner she summoned him to her private parlor. The ritual became automatic, a decanter of brandy, a locked door, and then lessons that felt less like conversations and more like indoctrination. Charles sat across from her like a student in a clandestine academy. She spoke in clipped, precise tones about inheritance law, about how to structure trusts to hide assets, about which judges could be leaned on, and which newspapers could be silenced with the right donation. She told him how her late husband had underestimated her, how every fortune hides a graveyard of inconvenient people, and how loyalty is always rented, never owned. Each revelation hardened Charles a little more, sanding off the last of his idealism. And here's what most people miss: corruption doesn't arrive as a thunderclap. It arrives as expertise. When someone offers you knowledge they don't teach in schools, your ego swells, you feel chosen, initiated. That's exactly how you get captured. Margaret played this note perfectly. She wasn't just seducing Charles physically anymore. She was seducing his self-image as a man of secret mastery, a man who saw the gears behind the facade. Meanwhile, Catherine's quiet investigation grew bolder. She intercepted a letter from the banker addressed to her mother, confirming a transfer of funds she knew Eleanor hadn't approved. Late at night, she began sketching a diagram of connections between names, dates, and amounts, a private map of her mother's hidden empire. Each line on the page deepened her suspicion that Eleanor's upcoming wedding was not a celebration, but a cover for something predatory. Margaret, for her part, had started to suspect Catherine's curiosity. In her steel gray eyes, Catherine was no longer simply the younger daughter. She was a liability, a variable in an equation Margaret was determined to control, and Margaret always controlled variables, even if it required elimination. As the wedding day drew closer, the Aldridge household had become a theater of masks, every smile rehearsed, every gesture hiding a blade. The air itself felt charged, as though the house were holding its breath before a storm. The summer light over Newport grew harsher, like it was exposing cracks in the marble facades. Inside Ravenscroft Manor, the tension felt almost electrical. Catherine's instincts sharpened into full awareness. Her mother was not simply overbearing, and Charles was not simply distant. Something systematic was happening. A slow turning of gears behind velvet curtains. She began to test her suspicions in small ways, dropping questions into conversations, noting Margaret's micro-reactions, watching Charles's eyes dart. Whenever the topic of the wedding shifted to finances, Catherine realized with a cold certainty that her sister was walking blindfolded toward a pit. Margaret, however, had entered her most dangerous mindset: preemption. To her, Catherine's intelligence wasn't an obstacle to crush outright, but a resource to redirect. She began inviting Catherine into family business discussions, positioning it as grooming her for responsibility. It was a classic tactic: fold the dissenter into the conspiracy, offer them a role before they have a chance to rebel. But Catherine's suspicion only deepened. She noticed her mother's language, the way Margaret spoke of legacy and necessary sacrifices, the casual references to people as if they were chess pieces. Charles, meanwhile, had become a ghost of himself. He still smiled for Eleanor, still allowed the fittings and rehearsals, but his eyes no longer tracked her. They tracked Margaret, waiting for a signal. In rare lucid moments he tried to draft letters breaking off the engagement. But he always tore them up, knowing Margaret held too many of his secrets. He had become a man caught between two gravitational pulls, one of innocence, one of power, and he no longer knew which was truly his. And this is where you watching need to recognize the pattern. This is not just a story about a mother and a daughter. This is about how power handles risk. It seduces, it entangles, and then it tests. Margaret's testing ground was her own household. But look at any institution, any empire. The same architecture appears, scaled up. Small betrayals first, then the binding, then the restructuring of loyalties until no one remembers the original lines. By late June, even the servants whispered about the atmosphere. Doors were double-locked, conversations halted when footsteps approached, and the grand house began to feel less like a mansion and more like a stage set for a ritual. The wedding invitation still promised celebration, but within the walls, something much closer to an execution was being prepared. By the final week of June, Ravenscroft Manor no longer felt like a family home at all. It had become a machine for psychological warfare, every corridor a pressure chamber. Margaret moved through it like a conductor directing an invisible orchestra. Her signals almost imperceptible, yet Charles responded to each one, as though his nervous system had been rewired. Eleanor floated through the preparations like a bride in a dream, clutching menus and fabric swatches while her future unraveled beneath her feet. Catherine, now fully aware of the stakes, carried hidden notes in the lining of her dress, each piece of evidence a potential key to stopping the catastrophe she sensed approaching. Margaret escalated again. She began speaking openly to Charles about a contingency plan. If the marriage to Eleanor did not go forward, she used coded phrases: asset transfer, emergency adjustment, the removal of obstacles. That to any outsider would sound like business jargon, but to Charles now sounded like the next assignment. His moral compass spun uselessly. He had crossed so many small lines he no longer recognized a large one. And here's the hidden rule: when you normalize secrecy, you normalize destruction. Margaret had done this to Charles step by step, turning him into a man who could contemplate things he once found unthinkable. Each whisper about a servant dismissed, each forged paper, each dark conversation had been a rehearsal for a larger betrayal. Catherine decided she could no longer wait. One evening she followed Charles to the study and confronted him, voice low but eyes fierce. "What has she done to you?" she demanded. "You're not the man who proposed to my sister." Charles looked at her as if from a great distance. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as though words themselves had been confiscated. That was when Catherine understood the true depth of her mother's grip. Margaret, sensing the confrontation even before it happened, appeared in the doorway with a calm that chilled Catherine's blood. "We're a family," she said softly. "Families have secrets, and those who respect them survive." Catherine's hand trembled around the papers she'd hidden in her sleeve. For the first time, she wondered if she was already too late, if the house itself had swallowed them all. The night after Catherine's confrontation, Ravenscroft Manor seemed to enter a kind of waking nightmare. The servants moved in hushed formations, the air charged with a static heaviness as if the building itself sensed an approaching fracture. Margaret acted unchanged. Breakfast trays, seating charts, calm instructions. But the tone of her voice was different now, stripped of charm. It was the voice of a general in a fortified camp. Charles drifted through the rooms in a daze. He had begun to experience flashes of the man he used to be, an image of Eleanor's laughter, the warmth of a summer walk before Margaret's schemes. But these memories were like postcards from a vanished country. He couldn't live there anymore. He was locked into Margaret's momentum. Each day another step he couldn't retrace. When he looked in the mirror, he saw not guilt but vacancy, a man hollowed out and repainted in darker colors. Margaret, meanwhile, began preparing a final demonstration of loyalty. She hinted to Charles that certain variables threatened the family's survival. Her tone was clinical, as though speaking about faulty parts in a machine. "If someone jeopardizes the legacy," she murmured one evening, "the legacy must defend itself." Charles didn't ask whom she meant. He already knew. Catherine realized she had no time left. She organized her notes into a single packet: forged ledgers, banker's letters, and a brief account of her mother's manipulation of Charles, and planned to send it to a trusted family friend in Boston. But even as she sealed the envelope, she felt the walls closing in. Margaret's awareness of her movements was uncanny, almost preternatural. Every time Catherine thought she'd found a private corner, Margaret appeared there later, commenting offhandedly about the decor or the weather, her eyes flicking to the places where Catherine had been standing. And here's the turning point you've been waiting for. This is where every long con tips into open danger. Up to now, Margaret had ruled with secrecy and seduction. Now she was preparing to rule with fear. The wedding was only days away, but within Ravenscroft Manor, it was no longer a countdown to celebration. It was a countdown to an act. A choice Margaret would demand that could annihilate whatever remained of Charles's conscience and possibly destroy Eleanor altogether. 2 days before the wedding, Ravenscroft Manor became a sealed fortress. The windows on the upper floors were shuttered. The servants were given abrupt holidays or reassigned to distant errands, and Margaret moved through the hallways like an empress on the eve of conquest. Outside, Newport bustled with preparations for the grand ceremony. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from secrecy to open anticipation. As though everyone sensed a performance about to begin, Margaret called Charles to the old conservatory just after midnight. The glass panes trembled with wind off the Atlantic, casting rippling shadows over the tiled floor. She handed him a slim, leather-bound notebook filled with names, dates, and bank codes. "This," she said softly, "is the whole picture. Everything my husband built, everything I preserved. With it we can control what happens after the wedding. But one loose end could ruin it all." She looked at him with eyes like sharpened glass. "You know which loose end I mean." The Charles stared at the pages, the implication unmistakable. For weeks she had been hinting, testing, circling the idea. Now she was naming it. Catherine. Margaret was pressing him to neutralize the one person who could expose them, not through legal maneuver but through something final. Here's the mechanism you're seeing in real time. Coercion at its apex. It begins with gifts, then secrets, then small tasks, then moral erosion. Finally, it demands an irreversible act. Once you cross that line, you can never testify, never return, never imagine yourself innocent again. Margaret wasn't just asking for Catherine's removal. She was asking for the death of Charles's old self. Catherine, in her room upstairs, sensed the stakes without hearing the conversation. She had already packed a small satchel, the incriminating documents sewn inside, and mapped a route to the train station. Her plan: leave before dawn, reach Boston, and deliver the evidence. But she underestimated Margaret's vigilance. Every door had been locked, every servant dismissed. Only Margaret and Charles knew the keys. As the clock struck 1, Charles closed the notebook and looked at Margaret. For the first time in weeks his face showed something like clarity, not obedience, but the dim flicker of a decision. The manor, silent and waiting, seemed to hold its breath. In 2 days' time the wedding would either proceed as a spectacle or implode into scandal, depending on which way that flicker tilted. The dawn before the wedding arrived not as light, but as a kind of gray haze over the cliffs, a colorless prelude to a day no one at Ravenscroft Manor would ever forget. Charles hadn't slept. He sat at the writing desk in his guest room, staring at the leather-bound notebook Margaret had given him, fingers trembling. Her demand, veiled but unmistakable, had clarified everything. If he obeyed, Catherine would vanish, and with her the last remnant of his old self. If he refused, Margaret would expose him and collapse the future he had built from betrayal. Down the hall Catherine dressed quickly, sliding the packet of evidence into a hidden pocket of her skirt. She had found a way to force open a window latch and planned to drop into the courtyard at first light. She knew the risk, but she also knew that staying meant surrender. The manor felt like a chessboard on which she and Charles were opposing pieces, each trying to break free of the Queen's control. Margaret, awake before sunrise, prepared the stage. She sent Eleanor into Newport with the seamstress, claiming a last-minute alteration, and ordered the servants to remain downstairs polishing silver. She moved with ritual precision, as though the wedding and its surrounding chaos were an alibi for something far older and darker. And this is the universal turning point. Power eventually demands a spectacle. Quiet manipulation is efficient, but a public act seals the myth. Margaret's myth was that she was untouchable, inevitable. For that myth to endure, she needed proof, a visible sacrifice. Charles finally rose from the desk and walked the hallway toward Catherine's room. Unsure until the last second what he would do, each step echoed like a verdict. In his hand he carried not a weapon but the notebook itself, as though it were a talisman that could still undo the past. Inside her room, Catherine heard the footfalls and pressed herself to the wall. She thought Margaret had come. When the door opened and she saw Charles, pale and unsteady, she realized this was the hinge moment of all their lives. Whether he whispered a warning or carried out an order would decide everything. Below them the manor was silent, Newport awakening beyond the cliffs. It was the last quiet hour before either the wedding bells rang or the whole facade collapsed into scandal and ruin. Catherine's breath caught as Charles shut the door behind him, his eyes darting to the window as though gauging escape routes. He looked less like a groom and more like a condemned man walking to the gallows. In a whisper edged with panic he told her everything. The brandy, the confession Margaret had forced from him, the plan for her accident before the ceremony. As he spoke, Catherine's face shifted from disbelief to cold fury. She had suspected a darkness between them, but not this. Not murder plotted in her own mother's handwriting. Charles's voice cracked. I didn't come to hurt you. I came because if we don't act now, she wins. She owns me already, but she doesn't have to own you. He pulled the packet of documents from his coat, the ones Catherine had hidden and he had discovered, and laid them out like a tarot spread of doom. Insurance policies, altered wills, medical records, all signed in Margaret's flawless hand. Catherine's stomach turned as she realized how deeply her mother's power extended, not just over their lives but over the institutions sworn to protect them. In that moment Charles offered her a way out. Together, he said, they could disappear before the ceremony. He had cash, a carriage waiting on the edge of town, contacts who owed him favors. Catherine stared at him, weighing her chances. Yet she also saw the tremor in his hands, the way his pupils widened when he spoke Margaret's name. Was he truly breaking free, or was this one more layer of her manipulation? Margaret using him as bait to draw her out. Below them the manor shifted with the soft noises of servants preparing the wedding breakfast. Unaware of the conspiracy overhead, the Atlantic winds beat against the windows like invisible fists. Catherine glanced to the window. She had planned to escape through alone. Now she had to decide to trust the man who had betrayed her sister, or leap into the unknown without him. And as the grandfather clock struck 9, a slow, deliberate knocking echoed from the door. 3 raps, the signal Margaret always used when she wanted someone summoned. Catherine's heart jolted. She and Charles locked eyes, knowing that whatever answer they gave in the next seconds would decide whether they lived or joined the long, hidden ledger of Margaret's sacrifices. The 3 knocks vibrated through the door like a judgment, each one a reminder that Margaret had choreographed this moment long before either of them had realized they were pawns. Catherine's eyes flicked to the window again. The salt wind clawed at the curtains, promising escape, but also a deadly drop to the rocks below. Charles's breath came in sharp bursts. His hand hovered over the latch, trembling between fight and surrender. He could already hear her voice in the hallway, calm and commanding, summoning him like a priestess calling a disciple to the altar. Catherine moved first. She grabbed his wrist and hissed, "If we open that door, it's over. She'll finish what she started." The 3 knocks came again, slower this time, more deliberate. Margaret never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The manner itself carried her authority. Charles closed his eyes, remembering the taste of the drug brandy, the look in Margaret's steel, gray eyes when she whispered the plan into his ear. He had crossed every moral line but one. If he crossed this last one, there would be no return. Downstairs, the wedding guests began to arrive. The rustle of silk, the clatter of carriages, laughter and greetings floating up like ghosts of another world. The illusion of a society wedding was still intact, but just barely. Catherine reached into her bodice and pulled out a small, antique revolver she had stolen from her father's study weeks before. She held it low, hidden by the folds of her skirt. "One door," she whispered. "One chance." The latch clicked from the outside. Margaret was unlocking the door herself. That small detail sent a shudder through Catherine. Her mother never did anything herself unless it was vital. The door eased open an inch. Through the gap came Margaret's perfume, bergamot, tobacco, and something colder, like iron. Her voice floated through, soft as velvet and hard as a blade. "Charles." "Catherine, it's time." In that split second, Catherine made her choice. She nodded once at Charles, an unspoken command to move, and turned toward the window, revolver in hand, ready to do what neither of them had dared until now's break the pattern, rupture the script, and drag this forbidden history into the open air, no matter the cost. The door swung wider, and the moment of reckoning finally arrived.